Hello everybody. Today I want to show you a few stitches, some classics and some basics, and a few seams that you will end up using throughout your career as a fashion designer. And these are very common stitches and seams, and they are really very pretty. So I will just start with a very basic one. It's the straight stitch that we use for everything. It's usually the number one on your sewing machine or the center dial, depending on what you have. So this is an electronic machine where we have everything more digital that you can see because you have a screen. Other machines are more mechanical, where you do things by twisting and turning dials or pushing up like hooks and buttons. So, but in the end, it's the same idea and the same outcome. So there's no difference. So I will just start with a basic straight stitch. And in my case, not in my case, in everyone's case, you should think about the length of your stitch. So that is the only definition that you can, the only variation that you can define the stitch. And, you know, if you go like to number 1, that means all the individual stitches are 1 millimeter long. And that is pretty short. So your seam will be very dense. If you go to number 2, that is a 2 millimeter stitch, and that is the most common stitch that we use for most projects. If you go longer, that is more decorative. If you have a top stitching and you don't want to really like pound into your fabric too often, then you go maybe a 3 or 4 and so on. So, but we will do the number 2 here, and I will just do a very plain basic straight stitch, get my fabric in here, and then I start sewing. I finish up by going reverse. And then I just go straight down my fabric here. I'll do it all the way down. And I finish off my seam. Always go reverse for a few stitches, because that way it will never get undone. So as you can see here, it's a very straight, very basic stitch. Like just for the fun of it, I did the reverse in red, so I can also check my my tension. So if you go really close here, you can see on my reverse, I see the red, but I also have dots of black. That means my top thread is coming to the wrong side of the fabric, versus on the other side I see black only, and I have some red dots in between. So if this looks the same but reverse, like black with red dots or red with black dots, then your tension is pretty much good. So that's a good indication to check, like if your tension in the machine is a little off, because that can happen. Usually we deal with the top tension, not the bottom one so much. The top tension, usually you have a dial somewhere on your machine where there is also a specific, like I show you here on top of it's here on top of my machine. And as you can see, there is a red line here and a dot, and if they align, so that is the basic, how would you say, the tension that the manufacturer would recommend. But if your top stitch is too loose, you would see it by having the top stitch all black, and then also have the bottom red and black, maybe half. So you would see way more black here at the bottom. And that means the top stitch is too loose. And that means I would change my top stitch tension a little higher. So it is a little tighter. The tension for the bottom, for my bobbin here, that will be done in the bobbin case. And that's a total different ballpark. So you don't really change that much. So never fiddle around with the bobbin tension. You fiddle around with the top tension. So I would recommend that. So the next stitch that we do is a basting stitch. And basting means it is temporary. It's something we do basting to hold pieces in place, and we did that for our zipper project, if you remember. So we stitched the seam, and then we did a basting stitch for the rest of the seam. So in that way, we did the so-called basting stitch to hold the pieces together perfectly, and then very easily it can be undone. And the way to do a basting stitch is basically we go down and we change our stitch length. So I will make it as long as possible. With this machine it goes to a 5. So that means it's 5 millimeters long. So it transports the fabric pretty quick through the machine, and you'll see in a second. And with a basting stitch, you usually don't finish it off with going back. So you keep that open and easy to be removed. So this is my basting stitch that I can, so this is my regular stitch, and that is the basting stitch. And you can see how long the individual stitches are. And in the back, same thing. You can see from the black dot to the black dot, that is my stitch length for the basting stitch. And here it is for the regular stitch, the 2 millimeter. See the difference? Okay, I will do another basting stitch next to the one that I just created. And for the fun of it, I will do a third one because I will use those later on. So what I always do when I do basting stitches, that I will leave quite a long thread at the end that I don't cut on both ends. So I have those longer ends, and you will see in a minute why I do this. So my next basic stitch that I wanted to show you is the zigzag. Zigzag is really fun. It is decorative. It can be done in a lot of different ways, and there are a few things how you define a zigzag stitch. So here on my machine, my zigzag choice would be the number 2 here. So I press number 2. You can see number 2 on my display. And then you can also choose the length of the stitch, meaning in how many increments you do the zig versus the zag. So here the manufacturer average recommendation is a 2, like 2 millimeters. And what you also define on your zigzag is the width of it. So if you want a very narrow zigzag, so where the zig and the zag are not very far apart from each other, then you might dial down to a 2. If you want a very wide zigzag, you go up to a 4 or 5. So then the zig and the zag are very far apart from each other. So I will do a lot of different things. So let's start with a very short, very small zigzag. So I do a 1 here in the length, and I also do a 1 here in the width. Then I will go to a 2, and I leave the 1 here. Then I will go to a 3, and I leave the 1. Then I do a 4 lengthwise, and then I go up to a 5, and the width is still a 1. So I will show you the result now. So here we have the width is a 1 and the length is a 1. So very, very tiny zigzag. Then we have here the same width but a 2 millimeter length. And then a 3, a 4, and at the bottom it's a 5. You can see how long those stitches are, and they are almost straight, but they do have a slight zigzag. So now I will change a few things around. I go back, the length I go back to just the middle, like a 2, and I will do a variation in my width. So I will, oops, go down here. So my stitch length is a 2, like the regular stitch length, and I start with a 1 width. Now I change the width into a 2. Then a 3. I do a 4. And a 5. So again, like here, we have the same length, the stitch length, but the width will vary. So a 1, width 1, it's the same as this one here, but then you can see the width is going wider and wider and wider. And a 5 at the end. So it is really wide, you know. It's kind of interesting, and you can play around with any kind of variation. So there are gazillions of variations just for the zigzag. And depending on what you want to do with your zigzag, that's how you decide which zigzag you use, or which width you use, which length you use. Most common, the zigzag stitch is used to finish a rough edge or an unfinished edge. Like this is a woven fabric, so the edge is always kind of coming apart and you like fringe a little bit. So that muslin doesn't fringe a lot, but you know, you can see that it's not really finished. And that's what I want to do with a zigzag stitch. And I would not go too small with if you use it as an edge finish, and I wouldn't go too wide, I wouldn't go too long, and I wouldn't go too short with it. So I will just do a very average, like let's say a 3 and 3. 3 and 3. So that way you can see how it ends up here. It kind of catches the little fringes at the edge and holds them back in place. Can you see that? I hope it's clear. And it, you know, therefore it really gives a nice finish. And it doesn't fringe at all anymore. So that's the nice thing about a zigzag. You don't need to have a serger or anything. A zigzag stitch does a very similar result. It looks a little slightly different, like for example, like this edge I did with a serger. So it also like finishes the whole the edge of the fabric, but the purpose of it is the same when you do a zigzag stitch. So that's fine. So now I wanted to show you two like more classic things to do with your stitches, and one is gathering. And I already prepared my gathering by doing 2 rows of basting stitches here. I'll put my foot down just to make the fabric not slide around. So I put it down, and I will also get a little closer with my camera. So what I did before, when I showed you the basting stitches here, I made 3 of those, and 2 of which I will use for my gathering. And a gathering is basically when you get your fabric all together and gather it in order to create some volume, like for example for a skirt or so. So for the gathering you do 2 rows of basting stitches, and then get that out of here. So what you then do, third one I really don't need, so I'll leave the top one by itself. So what you do then, you take the ends of your basting stitches, the top one, and that's the 2 black ones that I have here. So the red one is just hanging there. See, the red one is just hanging there, and I have the black one in my hand. So I gently pull that, and then I roll it on my finger, gently pull more, roll it on my finger, and in between I measure, you know, how my gathering is, because you always have a certain length or a measurement, how much you want to really get your fabric together. And you don't want to make it too tight or too loose, for that matter. And you do it basically halfway from this side and halfway from the other side. So let's say I'm quite happy with the gathering effect. So I will, and that's also important, I will put in a pin at the end here. And you do that kind of perpendicular. Put a pin there, and then I will wrap around my the thread that I just used for gathering. I'll just wrap that around in a figure 8 shape. So that will hold my piece in place, so it doesn't get undone or loose. Very often when you see gathered things, it's nicely gathered in the center, and then it gets less and less and less gatherings. So we don't want that. We want to have the gathering going from one side all the way to the other side. So now we do the same from the left side. I grab my 2 black threads here. So only the top. And then I start gathering it from this side. And I try to even it out so we have a really nice result. Okay. So then I put a pin in there, same thing. And I will wrap around my black thread in a figure 8 shape around my pin. to do that with the camera in my way, but I think we can manage. Okay. So with gatherings, really make sure that your little seams are kind of even. And even not only left and right, but also between the two seams, you know, that we have basically between the top and the bottom one, that we have the same amount of gathering. So double check. Then you double check your measurement, you know, from here to there. So if your whatever it is, a waist for a skirt, or you know, whatever you want to do, that it has the right measurements, and then you can stitch it and fix it that way, so you keep the gathering in place. And the way to do that is we go back on our sewing machine here, get my thread underneath, and I start stitching it in the center between those two basting stitches. So now I want to be right in the middle. I don't want to cross the basting stitches, because those basting stitches, as I said before, they are just temporary. This is not what we want in the long run. So we get back to our straight stitch, regular length, like a 2, and I start right behind the pin that had all my threads wrapped around, so I don't want to go over those. So my pin is basically behind my needle. So my needle and the first stitch I do by hand, because I don't want to hit the pin. So I do 2 or 3 stitches first, then I go reverse. And then I go up to my needle, but not over it. Okay, then I can remove it. So this is what we have now. We have basically our 2 basting stitches and then our straight stitch in between. And this straight stitch in between is the one that holds everything in place. So now I can remove my pin on both sides. I can remove them. And because basting stitches are only temporary, that's what I am doing now. I can just pull them out. I pull the first one and then the second basting stitch. I just pull it. And because I pulled the top stitch, that means my bottom's thread is just coming off by itself. Very simple. Oops. Like those 2. And what's left is only my straight stitch. So this is how you do a gathering. And it is held in place by my ending here, by the, you know, finishing on both sides. So even if I pull, it doesn't get undone. So now we have our zigzag variations, all, you know, like at the edge here and there. Then we have our straight stitch, we have our gathering, our basting stitch, and then our gathering. So that is one option to, you know, create some volume where you need volume. And then another stitch that, or another classic that I wanted to show you is how you do elastics. So, and that is also a pretty simple, straightforward procedure, is if you have a piece of an elastic, and I have like one right here, you know, just one elastic thing that you usually put into some pants or yoga pants or skirts or whatever you want. So I cut a piece of that, and then I want to have that elastic maybe going from left to right on my piece here. So this is the measurement of my piece, and this is my elastic that I have. So I want to have that piece, the width of the elastic. And in, you know, you could just put it together and start sewing and pulling and whatnot. But the best would be to make it in little increments. And increments means I will just, for example, have this elastic and check where my half point is. So my half point is here. So I put a pin in there. So this is half. And maybe a quarter point as well. So I just fold it. I mean, you can also do it with measurements and calculations and all that, but I'd rather fold it and check it that way. So it's a really hard spot right here. Maybe that's easier. Okay, so that's my quarter, and then I do another quarter on the other side. Okay, so now I have 4 quarters on my elastic, and I do the same with my fabric. So first I check my half point, where is my center? So I put a pin right there. And then I will mark my quarter point. Pin right there. And my other quarter point with a pin right there. So make sure that the pins are all on the same side. Okay, so when you look at your, oops, that didn't go in really well. So when you look at your piece here, God, that's the special show effect. So you have 4 increments that are the same on your fabric, and then you have 4 increments that are the same on your elastic. And now you can put the elastic on your fabric, holding it in place. Put another pin in there. Lots of pins, I know. I'm not a big pinner, but that way, you know, it holds in place. So the way to do it now, see my first pin on my elastic and the first pin on my fabric. They have to match. They have to be on top of each other. So you start sewing. First you stitch, you secure your elastic, and then you pull as hard as you can so those two pins lay on top of each other. And then stitch to there. Then you pull your elastic till the pin number 2 and the elastic pin number 2 are on top of each other, and stitch them together. And then you do that with the third one, and then you do that with the rest of it to the edge of the fabric. And that way your 4 individual segments are exactly the same, they have the same gathering. And that's the best way to do elastics, especially like, let's say you have a whole elastic going around a waistband. So if you just start pulling and whatnot, it gets so uneven, and you have like a lot of elastic on one side and then nothing left on the other side, or way too much left on the other side. So you don't want that to happen. So let's just do that here on my sewing machine. So I go down with my foot to hold it in place. I will choose a zigzag stitch for that because it is elastic. I want everything to be stretch, you know, like I want everything to move or be able to move. So I will choose a zigzag stitch that is kind of a length, maybe number 2, and the width is also a number 2. So not too wide and not too long. And then I will try to stitch like the bottom, and then I will stitch at the top again. So I do 2 rows because it is a pretty wide elastic. Till your first pin. So I can remove the pins, both of them, the one from the fabric and the one from my elastic. So now I will check where my second is, my second pin, where I'm heading to. So I'm here at the second pin. So I remove both of those. And I'll go to my third. Remove both of them. And then I pull the rest all the way to my edge. And then I really want to finish it really well. So then I turn my piece around, move over to the other side, so I'm on the top now on my elastic. Get my machine down. And I do basically the same thing as I did before, now without the pins, because the definition where I should be, I already did with those pins in place. Okay. So this is basically what we just did. We put that elastic in. Of course, I have to cut all the threads off. And of course, I would never do that with black. I would always use like a matching color, but you want to see what I did. So you can see that the elastic is in there pretty even. So there is no unevenness to that. And when you look at it from the other side, where you only see the fabric, it's kind of a nice result that way. And when you want to gather things together, always separate them in increments. Is it thirds or quarters or halves or whatever you do? Divide it up into maybe 4-inch long increments.